When people talk about camera settings and explain them, usually they are explaining the technicals of how the camera settings work, what they affect, and that's because, well, that's the most important and obvious part of camera settings. You want to make sure your exposure is not too bright so that you can capture all the detail, and we're still going to teach you that, but it goes beyond the technicals. Hello, I am Noah from Anything Cameras, the channel that focuses on helping you improve your filming and photography. Now, you can't deny that photography tells a story. That's basically what all the past 3 episodes in this mini-series have been about, especially the first one. And then we talked about lighting and composition, so now we're on to the camera settings. How do these work? How do they affect the way your image feels, the story that is told, and the emotion that is ultimately portrayed in the final photo? Well, the problem is that oftentimes they don't. Instead, oftentimes they are set up so that in editing and post-production, you can then alter the look of the image and fine-tune it to tell that story and bring across that emotion. In other words, you set your settings so that later in editing, you can work with the image how you want to, and portray the emotion from that image the way you want to portray it. So then why are we bothering to make this video? Well, that's because we still want to explain to you some of the basic camera settings, how they work, and while we're at it, we're going to explain how those settings affect your story so that in editing, we don't have to go through each individual one. Let's start with the exposure triangle. As you probably know, the exposure triangle is made up of 3 settings: ISO, shutter speed, and aperture, that affect how bright your image is, because that's what exposure is, just how bright or dark your image is. And here in this photo, we have a very extreme example of how exposure tells a story. Well, this photo doesn't, because it is too bright. You can't make out any detail in it, and therefore there's no story or emotion to be brought in because you can't understand what's going on in the photo. If we expose the image properly, suddenly all of the detail is back in the photo, you can understand what's going on, and that emotion, that story are portrayed across. Now, how does the exposure triangle work from a more technical standpoint? Well, the first of those items that control your exposure from the exposure triangle is shutter speed. And this is just how fast your shutter actuates, goes across the sensor and comes back up, so that your sensor can take that exposure and turn it into an image. The faster the shutter speed is, the less light makes it onto the sensor. The slower it is, the more light comes onto your sensor. This is almost always notated using fractions of a second, unless you're doing long exposure photography, in which case it might be multiple seconds. And shutter speed also controls the motion blur in your image, because if you have a moving subject and you have a really fast shutter speed, maybe 1/1000th of a second, then that shutter speed is going to capture light from just one instance of the movement of the subject, and it won't be blurry. But if you have a slower shutter speed, then while that shutter is open, the subject may move, creating blur in the image that is captured in the image. The second variable is aperture. This is how wide the iris in your lens is that lets light through, and this can actually be controlled. The wider the iris, the brighter the image; the smaller the iris, the darker the image. This is often notated using f-stops, so you would see f/ some number. Often, very basic lenses will have a largest aperture of f3.5, and often will go down to a small aperture of f22. Lastly, there's ISO or ISO. This is the digital gain applied to your image to brighten it up digitally, but this does have an effect on another aspect of your image, and that is the digital noise in the image. Now, when I say noise, I don't mean noise you hear with your ears. Instead, I mean interference in the signal that is brought from amplifying the image digitally, and this appears in little grain. Sometimes it's red, green, and blue grain. Sometimes it's more dark color grain, kind of gray. And this will just make your image look nasty and lose detail. Another setting that is very common is white balance. This is how your camera sees white, because you know, light can be different colors. If, for instance, you might be working outside when the light is nice and white, color accurate, but you might also be working inside where the light is very yellow. White balance will account for that yellowiness of the light in the house so that it looks white to the camera's eyes, because a yellowy photo is just gross. But you can also make smaller adjustments to the white balance. make the photo just a little bit cooler or a little bit warmer, and these portray different emotions. A cooler image will seem a little less inviting, a little more sometimes sinister or cold, because cold can mean more than just temperature, physical temperature, or the color temperature. Cold can mean not friendly. Whereas if you have a warmer photo, the feeling that is brought across will be warmer, more welcoming, inviting, more relaxing. And that's kind of, I guess, because we are used to the sun, which can be quite warm. The last setting I want to touch on for telling your story is the file type you shoot in, because if you shoot in RAW, which is what we recommend, when you go to edit, you're going to have more flexibility, more data to work with to fine-tune your image in order to create it in the way you want to. If you shoot JPEG, then you won't have as much detail to work with. If you try to alter the exposure or even alter the colors, you're going to see digital artifacting and loss of detail much more quickly, so you won't be able to work as much with the image in post-production to fine-tune it to how you want the emotion to come across. Now, sometime in the near future, we are going to be working on a photography course that will talk about the technicals and the story and go way more in depth, talk about more topics. So if you want to be notified of the process of that course, where we might be in the current process, then you can go down and you can sign up for email notifications. They will be infrequent, they won't be spammy, we promise. Also, keep watching the series right here.